We began the siege of Fort St. John's by digging trenches, sending out scouts, and clearing roads to connect our forward base with the main camp, as well as our battery to the south of the fort. The enemy kept up a steady barrage, but did little damage. The grand encampment headed by General Montgomery was set up south of Fort St. John's, with about 400 men who were to carry on the siege. The encampment south of St. John's lay about 1.25 miles from the lower fort. The place of the encampment was a low, miry ground. The tents, and all of the paths between them, were wet and soggy. Mud and water were nearly over shoe, and the troops there were obliged to raise the ground with brushes, barks, and flags in order to keep dry. At the lower camp to the north of the fort was our advance post. Our garrison of about 600 was composed of those of us remaining of the 4th Connecticut, along with Bettle's Rangers and Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys. Many from our original regiment had been sent back due to sickness. The force on the lake consisted of the schooner Liberty, the sloop Enterprise, and the gondolas Schuyler and Hancock. On September 20th, Major Brown, who had been scouting, returned to camp with a British prisoner, and more importantly, wine, pork, butter, shoes, and clothing. The next day, Colonel Warner and a detachment of 200 men headed to La Prairie. At the same time, Ethan Allen and a group of volunteers headed northwest to capture Montreal. Seemed reckless to me, but we all hoped for good news. If he succeeded, the garrison at St. John's would be forced to surrender. In the meantime, we prepared to starve the enemy out. For the next week, we were pummeled by storms and shells. We expected every day and every hour to have a battle. Heard every day that the enemy was coming upon us. Sometimes, we had news at midnight that the enemy was close by, and we'd run out to our station at the breastwork and stay there until further orders. We'd lay low, in the mud, staring into the darkness, hoping we wouldn't be struck by cannon fire. On quieter nights, there was a barn not far away that offered some shelter, but so many of us would pack in at a time that it was difficult to get any sleep. The afternoon of the 25th, 2 batteries were erected just south of the fort. The sound of cannon fire was nearly constant. One by one, we were being picked off by the enemy's bombardments. All we could do was hope that our batteries were doing more damage within the fort. But looking at the stone walls in the distance, compared to our ragged trenches, there was a sense of helplessness that was difficult to ignore. This was as dark a season as we ever saw during the whole siege of St. John's. The weather was discouraging, the ground grew exceedingly muddy and wet, and the whole adjacent country was miry. We lived as half-drowned rats crawling through a swamp. Each day brought more rain, more shells, and more death. Eventually, the day also came that brought bad news. Colonel Allen's attack on Montreal had failed. He was captured and taken off to England. Not long after, the Canadians who had joined us seemed to grow cool and fearful, and some in their number left. To make matters worse, our provisions grew scant. How could we possibly starve out the enemy if we couldn't even feed ourselves? In early October, we'd heard reports that Governor Carleton had assembled no less than 1,500 men with him at Montreal. The Canadian forces loyal to the Crown would soon be on their way to attack our advance post. We requested reinforcements from the main camp, but none came. Instead, Montgomery ordered an expansion and repair of the defenses around his own grand encampment. We were being left for dead, but we held out, determined to do all that we possibly could in the common cause of our country. Finally, it seemed relief had arrived in the form of a 13-inch mortar, nicknamed the Old Sow. However, the location Montgomery and his New York master gunner had us dig out for the artillery battery was too far away for the shells to hit the fort. And for every shell fired by our artillery gunners, the enemy struck back with 3. A council of war was called, and Montgomery introduced his next plan. He wished to have us construct a new battery atop a hill close to the fort so that our shells could do more damage. This proposed tactic seemed like madness to us. Any soldier sent to dig on the hill would be an easy target. Montgomery had led us from blunder to blunder, and we'd had enough. Tempers boiled over, and the word mutiny was being muttered throughout the camp. Colonel Waterbury, the second in command to the general, delivered our counter-proposal that the new battery be placed on the opposite end of the line, on the east bank of the river. This location would be better protected and could be used to strike at the British vessel, the Royal Savage, which still threatened both our Navy and our ground troops. With a phalanx of Connecticut officers watching him stonily, and the rest of us waiting nearby, Montgomery submitted and consented to our plan. Practically a prisoner in his own army, the general lamented, "I cannot help observing of how little purpose I am here." And perhaps for the first time, not one of us disagreed with him. A few days later, much to Montgomery's chagrin, our plan succeeded. The Old Sow struck and sunk the Royal Savage. The enemy's greatest weapon was destroyed, and our Navy was now safe to move freely on the river. Commodore Douglas then suggested to the general that we could safely begin constructing another battery, this time to the west side of the river. Our indignant general refused, but with a little rum, Douglas convinced the men to construct the battery anyway. Realizing how powerless he was, Montgomery didn't bother attempting any disciplinary action, and instead chose to ignore that the battery had ever been built. Now able to journey north safely, a division led by Brown and Livingston slipped past the fort's defenses and captured the enemy's supply depot at Chambly. Luckily, the British commander at Chambly had neglected to destroy the considerable military stores when he capitulated. Although we continued to lose men to sickness, we had St. John's completely surrounded, and enough provisions to starve them out. The siege had shifted in our favor.